Have you ever found yourself having the same relationship problems over and over and over again? You keep dating the same guy, you keep dating the same girl, you keep having the same type of argument over and over again. Well, in this episode of Beyond at Home, we're gonna look at one thing that you can do to make sure that you don't keep repeating the same relationship mistakes. Let's go. Now, before we get to how to break this cycle, I think there's a question that we have to ask first. And the question is, why is it that in relationships we repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again? Well, there's a few reasons for that, and I think there's a few assumptions that we carry into relationships that cause us to do this. The first one is something that I like to call the experience myth. Now, the experience myth is the idea that experience will make me wiser, but that's not true. Experience will make you older. See, it's only evaluated experience that makes you wiser. And in relationships, the reason that we often don't evaluate our experiences is because there's someone else in the relationship. So what happens when a relationship ends? She was crazy. All guys are like that. All girls are like that. It's just the same thing over and over again. Here's the next myth. The know better myth. Now, when I first got married, I didn't know there was a correct way to fold towels. And so my wife would constantly tell me over and over again, babe, here's the right way to do it. I'd be like, babe, I know. Does that sound familiar to you? Maybe someone tells you like, hey, you keep dating the same kind of people over and over again. I know. You know, you keep kind of falling for the same mistakes relationally. I know. I'm not going to read that book. I'm not going to listen to that podcast. Why? Because I know better, therefore I'll do better. But we all know that's not actually the case. Know better doesn't mean that we'll do better. The third myth or assumption we come up with is the time myth. Get it? And this myth usually starts popping up around the age of 25 for people. When we start to say things like, well, there's only so much time left, or if I have to go to another engagement party, if I have to go to another wedding, I am going to scream. Time tells us that the clock is counting and we have to make quick decisions relationally. Now, if you buy into the time myth, there's probably nothing I can do to convince you otherwise, but here's what you need to know. When it comes to relationships, time is your friend. Because time brings two things that nothing else can. Time brings perspective and clarity. You get to learn things with perspective that you didn't know in the moment. You get to hear things that you wouldn't hear in the moment. And now that we've kind of explored these three myths or assumptions that kind of keep us repeating these same relational mistakes, here's how we fix it. Now, in order to fix this, I want to introduce you to a guy called Paul who lived in the first century. Now, Paul was someone who used to live one way and then underwent a whole series of changes and began to live a completely different way. And after he began living this new way, Paul would actually go and start churches all around the Mediterranean rim. Now, here's the thing you need to know about the first century culture. They were pagan, they were idol worshippers, temple prostitution was considered quite normal. And so Paul went into this culture, and there were so many times that Paul would say, hey, if you want the most out of your life, you actually have to live in a brand new way. And so Paul would write letters to these churches all around the Mediterranean rim. And in one letter in particular, a letter to the church in Rome, this is what he said to them. He said, I urge you, brothers and sisters. In other words, I'm imploring you, I'm pleading with you because this is not natural. What I'm about to tell you is not easy to do. In light of God's mercy. This is the 12th chapter that Paul's writing. And so he's had 11 chapters to kind of get up to this part. And if you're kind of wondering like, Chris, what does God's mercy look like? You should go back and read the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans. But he goes on, he says, in light of God's mercy, to offer your bodies to God as a living sacrifice, which I'll come back to that because that just sort of seems way too much. He says, this is the true and proper way to worship God. Now let's just address that whole like, give your bodies to God as a living sacrifice, because we don't kind of understand that in the 21st century, but the first century audience would have so well understood that. And what Paul was sort of saying here is the most logical thing to do is to give your life to God. Think about it this way. If God is the creator of the universe, if there is a God who punctuated history by dying on a cross for your sake and my sake to restore our relationship, then the most logical thing that we can do is actually to get to know him, is actually to live life the way that we were designed to live life. And then he goes on, and this is how we kind of fix this repeated thing in our relationships. He says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. This is the idea of like, don't be pushed into the mold. Don't go with the flow. Don't date the way everyone else is dating. He says, instead, do this. Be transformed. Kind of like Optimus Prime, like be transformed. And then he says, here's how you get transformed. By the renewing of your mind. Now notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, pray a prayer, make a commitment, do a 21-day challenge. Paul says, no. If you want to live in a different direction, it's going to be a process. It's going to take some time. In fact, for those of you who are watching that have like done woodwork, you know that if you try to put on the new without peeling off the old, what happens? The new falls off straight away. And Paul knew this as well. In order to put on the new, we first have to take off the old. We first have to transform and renew the way in which we think. And I'm going to give you a really simple way that you can transform the way you think and renew your mind. In order to fix it, you need to first ask a question. Do you want to be a conformer or a transformer? Really, the decision is in your hands. You need to decide, do you want to date the way everyone else dates, or do you want to change that? So I've got two things that you can do. One of them, I'll be honest, you won't want to do. But here's the first thing I want you to do. I want you to figure out what parts of your life need to transform. What are the areas? Is it that you're too quick to anger? Is it that you don't take feedback well? Is it you fight about the same thing over and over again? Is it you feel that you always need to be in a relationship to feel like you're complete? That's the first thing I want you to do. And then here's the second thing, and this is only for people who are single. I want you to take a year off dating. I know I told you you're not going to want to do that, but here's why I think this is important. Because as I said earlier, when it comes to relationships, time is your friend. And if you don't want to have relationships like the majority of relationships, then you're going to need to take some time to transform that area of your life. It's not going to take a week. It's not going to take a month. It might take actually longer than a year, but a year is the minimum I would suggest. Just take some time out, pray more, join a group, start to serve, read your Bible regularly. And over that year, you'll begin to transform the way you think about relationships, and you'll also be prepared for the next time you get into one. So, if you don't want to date like the majority of daters, do something different in the meantime. Thanks so much for stopping by the channel. If you haven't, give it a like and a subscribe, and we would love if you would follow us on socials at Beyond Church AU, and we'll see you next time for another episode of Beyond at Home.